All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our conversation this evening about all things related to jury service. But this evening, we're having particular conversations about some recent cases that you may have heard about in the news. My name is Will Snowden. I am the director of the Juror Project. Really excited to be here with you all tonight. And I invite my colleague, Porsha-Shaf'on, to introduce herself as well.
Hi, good evening, everybody. I'm Porsha-Shaf'on Venable, and I am the Deputy Director of the Juror Project. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. We are jury duty nerds, one. We are advocates for the community, two. And three, we are here to be a resource for you all to think critically about the role that juries play in our criminal legal system, the power that the community has in that jury box, but also to help explain things that happen in our criminal legal system that are worthy of longer conversations. And the thing about the Juror Project's three main goals: one, we are trying to increase diversity of jury panels. Two, we're trying to improve people's perspectives of jury duty. And three, we are trying to ensure people understand the power that they have when they make it to that jury box. What are we going to, or actually, what's in this series? I'm going to ask Porsha-Shaf'on to share with us about the series that we're doing.
So we have an unmasking, right? Unmasking of the juror box. We are really trying to educate community members about all things related to jury service. And we are going from the rooter to the tutor. So if you missed the last live, we discussed the process of jury service, right? How jurors are veneers are created. I'm gonna be testing y'all at the end. Do y'all remember some of the words that we use, like voir dire, veneer? I'm just kidding. I'm not gonna test y'all. But by way of just a brief recap, we talked about how jurisdictions create the veneer, and that is select individuals to come in to report for jury duty. Then we talked about the different ways in which diversity can be created or increased, rather, with the veneers. We talked about juror pay, and we talked about, well, what was the last thing? I'm missing one thing. One other thing we talked about.
Well, we talk about felony disenfranchisement, community mindset, juror pay, the lists that are used to summon jurors, and pulling all those
Yes.
things together to understand how juries are actually formed in America.
And how juries are formed, but also how certain communities and or individuals and perspectives are included by only using certain ways in which we create the veneer. So, for example, many jurisdictions only use voter registration and DMV records, right? And that assumes a lot. That assumes that everyone is registered to vote and or has a state identification. And because only those two ways are often used in communities, Will talked about these other ways in which folks are excluded. So he talked about felony disenfranchisement. He talked about pay, and just taking a step back to how the veneers are created, often only using these two types of, why am I forgetting the word that I want to use? Two types of
Sourceless.
sourceless. I'm like, why is the word escaping me? Only using these two types of sourceless, right? There are other ways in which we can create diversity using other sourceless. Thank you, Will.
Mm-hmm.
Other ways are public housing records, are public benefits records, right? And that will expand the pool and also be another vehicle to create juror diversity.
That's right. I want to highlight for you all what we're going to be discussing this evening. Last week, there was a verdict in a case involving 5 Memphis police officers who were accused of killing Tyree Nichols. We're going to explore that case, and we're going to talk about the jury. And we're also going to talk about another case that's been making the news headlines as it relates to a man whose name is Mr. Hinton, whose son was killed by police officers, and the impact of that death and how it had on him and the actions that took place after he saw the body camera of his son being killed by the police. So let's start with Tyre Nichols. The name might sound familiar, and if you don't remember the case, I'll just give you a quick 30-second summary. In Memphis, Tyre Nichols is pulled over for allegedly committing some type of a traffic violation. The reason why I say allegedly is because that's why they say he was stopped. But the chief of police for the Memphis Police Department reviewed the dash camera footage and any accompanying body camera footage. And out of her own mouth, she said that there was no type of video evidence that sustained stopping Tyre Nichols for a traffic violation. In any event, Tyre Nichols is stopped. He eventually runs away from the scene of the traffic stop after being confronted by this unit of police officers in the Memphis Police Department who are specifically targeting violent crime in Memphis. And there wasn't any information about Tyre Nichols allegedly being involved with violent incidents of violence or being armed and or dangerous or anything like that. And what ends up happening is he is fleeing towards his mother's home in fear of his life. The officers catch up to him and they beat him, and he ultimately dies as a result of the beating he sustained at the hands of the police officers. Those police officers were taken to trial, and they were charged with the beating and the killing and also some other charges, including kidnapping of Tyre Nichols. And this happens in Memphis, Tennessee, which is included in Shelby County. And some of you might know Memphis, Tennessee is about 55% African American. And I share that with you because sometimes we can look at the demographics of a city to think about what the jury should look like. And so Memphis being about 55% African American, the jury, hopefully, if the system is working the way it's supposed to, facilitates a jury that is about 55% African American as well. But that's not what happened in this case. All 5 officers for this particular trial were found not guilty of all of charges, not by a Memphis jury. They were found not guilty by an all-white jury that came from a county, Hamilton County, which is about 4 hours away from Shelby County. And so the question we should be asking ourselves is, how does an all-white jury get seated in Memphis? And how is this verdict supposed to be representative of what the community in Memphis perhaps would have wanted? So let me break it down for you. There's something called a change of venue. And lawyers can file a motion to change venue when they believe that the jurisdiction has been exposed to so much information about the case that the potential jurors have been tainted, their perspective has been tainted by the media coverage. Said differently, because of the overwhelming media coverage, any potential juror may have already formed an opinion about the case. And so to protect the right to have a fair and impartial jury, defense lawyers can file motions to change the venue, to be able to have the case argued in front of a jury that has not been exposed to that same media coverage. Those of you that are watching this that aren't in Memphis probably have heard about this case. And the reason why I say that is that this is a case that got national media coverage. So the question becomes, how could you identify a community in Tennessee that has not heard about the Tyre Nichols when this was a case that was being covered on a national level? In any event, the motion to change venue was granted. And the county that is selected is not 55% African American like Shelby County is. It's in fact 77% white or European American, right? And we think about how those individuals coming from Hamilton County are now sitting in place of a Memphis jury, and how values can change depending on the community that you are in. So this all-white jury sits in a case involving Tyre Nichols, who's African American, the 5 officers who are also African American, and a city that's majority African American. But the people power in this trial was not representative of the Memphis community. And so they vote not guilty. And the officers had already been found guilty on a federal level, but of different charges. There also have been representations that one of the main aggressors pled guilty. And so there's a unique conversation happening with this particular case as it relates to the jury and how a Memphis community was not represented in the jury to be part of the conversation as it relates to the accountability that those officers should have been delivered as a result of their actions. So, Porsha, when you heard about this case, or when you heard about the jury, what were some of your initial reactions?
So, first, responding to your question about when I heard about the case, right? And I always think, whenever, first as a Black woman, and then as a defense attorney, I always, whenever I hear the fact that someone ran from the police, the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. And not for the reasons that many of you are probably thinking, but it's because I know what people impute on that action, right? And people often, when they hear that someone ran from the police, they assume, and I've heard this time after time after time, that if you run from the police, you must have done something wrong, right? I hear that from community members. I often hear that from prospective jurors. Why would someone run from the police if they didn't do anything wrong? And it assumes a lot, right? It assumes
Mhm.
that it assumes that every single person in this country has the same experience, the same perspective of police, and their safety in the context of the police's presence, right? So that was one of the first things that I thought of, is I was deeply worried about how people were going to react to the fact, and it is a fact beyond dispute, that Tyree ran, but what people were going to assume or decide about his life and about the police actions in response to that action. So I was worried about that piece. The second thing that I was actually worried about, or the second thing that was troubling for me, was just watching the video, watching the police beat this young man over and over again. And then the last thing is what happened about a week and a half ago, right? And that was hearing the verdict of not guilty, and wondering, one, how all of the jurors were white, and like, what was that process like, and what was the like, what were the jurors thinking when they came up with their verdict? So those
Mhm.
have been sort of all of the thoughts, and I hope that I'm articulating myself clearly, because it's all jumbled up, right? We all
Mhm.
have thoughts and feelings about each and every one of those things potentially, but those are things that
Yeah.
were in my head.
Thanks for that. And I want to correct something that I misspoke on. So there were 5 officers involved. There were 3 officers that were acquitted last week. Not, I originally said 5. And I also want to clarify, when the police pulled Tyree Nichols over, they yank him out the car. And, that's not how traffic stops are supposed to go down. You're not supposed to get yanked out of your vehicle. And unfortunately, we have too many examples we can reference when people are yanked out of their car, particularly Black people are yanked out of their car by law enforcement, and the violence that comes after that is something worthy of running away from. And he was running home. He was running towards his mom's house, seeking perhaps her protection from the law enforcement officers. And they catch up to him and they brutally beat him in ways in which he dies 3 days later of what the medical examiner describes as like blunt force trauma, essentially, and describing similarities between the beating that Tyree Nichols received and injuries that he's seen from people in fatal car accidents. And I share that with you so that we can understand the level of violence that law enforcement committed on Tyree Nichols. Not for accused of committing a murder, not for being accused of some type of a sexual assault, but for being pulled over illegitimately and running away from law enforcement after they yanked him out of the vehicle. So then we think about the jury and the change of venue and the fact that we don't have a jury that's representative of Memphis. We don't have any people from Memphis on the actual jury. And then people are asking the question, well, don't you have a right to a jury of your peers? Porsha-Shaf'on, is there anywhere in the law where you have seen peers defined?
That word peers is often defined or perceived very broadly, right? And when we hear peers um in the context of this, in the Sixth Amendment, right? We our brains, despite the fact that it just says a jury of your peers, we often think as Black people, a jury of our peers means other Black people. We don't necessarily think about it more broadly, which is a jury of our peers that have similar perspectives, that have similar socioeconomic backgrounds, right? We come from
Mm-hmm.
the exact same neighborhood. So the word jury of our peers, or rather the word peers, as outlined in the Constitution, is somewhat quite, it's very broad.
Yeah. The Constitution says you have a right to an impartial jury. And an essential component of that Sixth Amendment right is called a fair cross section. And when we think about a fair cross section, we should be thinking about what is a representative sample of the community that mirrors the representation of the community. So we have the Sixth Amendment right that says you are entitled to select your jury from a fair cross section. And something that I'm going to research is how are we ensuring that the Sixth Amendment right is followed when a person is being taken to trial in a jurisdiction that isn't where the case actually took place. And so here, it's an interesting perspective because I'm coming to the conversation about the Tyree Nichols case, looking at this jury and also being considerate of the Memphis community who was not represented on this jury, but through the lens of the accused person. It is the accused that has the right to a fair cross-section. And here, the accused, these three police officers, got the verdict they were looking for. But we have to understand it is not just for the purpose of the accused that the fair cross-section matters. When we look at a jury and we see that it does not represent the community, we are going to question the integrity of that conviction or of that acquittal. And we're also going to think that because this jury does not represent the community where the harm was alleged to have taken place, the person is not going to get a fair trial. And so I worry about how there are people in Memphis who believe that these officers were not held accountable, particularly when there was nobody from the Memphis community that was represented on this jury.
Agreed. I think about the message that sends to, parents of Black children, the message that sends to Black people in the community. Because I want to be clear, right? For those of you that are not familiar with the case, these officers were Black. These officers were Black men. And it's important to note that, we often we often forget that these cases are not happening in a vacuum. These cases are happening very publicly, and it sends a message to everyone watching what Black safety means individually and what Black safety means collectively, right? And I think the thing that I struggle with most is y'all couldn't find no Black people nowhere. Y'all couldn't
Mm,
y'all couldn't find anyone that was reflective of the community that these officers have to answer to nowhere. And I think and again, right, as an attorney, and I'm not trying to play, what do y'all say? Monday night quarterback, Monday
mm-hmm.
morning quarterback. I'm
Monday
not
morning, yeah.
I'm not trying to criticize or, make any disparaging remarks. Um I just don't understand. I
Yeah.
just I just don't understand.
When we think about how we come to this work at the Juror Project. One of our goals that I talked about is we're trying to increase diversity of jury panels. And we are also both criminal defense lawyers, right? And here we are expressing concern over a verdict where the accused was found not guilty, which is the exact verdict that you and I seek when we are in court. But we have to remember that our country has a history and a practice of removing Black and brown people from accessing the power of that jury box. And here is an example where the court did not make the decision to, when they changed the venue, when they granted that change of venue motion, they could have tried to research, and maybe they did, I don't know, I haven't spoken to the judge. But ideally, you would want the system to try to research finding a county in Tennessee that has a similar demographic representation and gender representation of Memphis, of Shelby County. But without that representation, with such a stark difference between Shelby County and Hamilton County, it begs the question of how was this a fair trial? One of the things that we were talking about, Porsha-Shaf'on and I were providing a training actually earlier this morning, and one of the participants shared a phrase that I feel a lot of Black people have heard before, and I think other people of color maybe have heard it as well. The phrase is "all skin folk ain't kin folk," right? And it's recognizing that just having a Black person on the jury doesn't mean that that's enough, but not having any Black people is a constitutional concern. And I'm saying it's a constitutional concern because remember, the Sixth Amendment says you have a right to select your jury from a fair cross-section of your community. There is something called the vicinage clause of the Sixth Amendment, which specifically invokes the values of the community to be able to sit in judgment of another member of their community who's accused of committing harm against that community. And the community gets to be represented via the jury box to think about what accountability, if any, should be assigned for this individual if they did in fact commit that harm. And when you transfer the venue, you lose that those values of the community where the harm is alleged to have taken place. Now, Porsha-Shaf'on, you are a national expert when it comes to jury nullification. Could you please, one, just very quickly remind us what is jury nullification? And then I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think this is an example of jury nullification in this case?
So for those of you that are not familiar with the term jury nullification, it essentially means when the juror votes their conscience. When a person is accused of a crime, the prosecutor has a duty to prove every single element, every single crime charged. And they do in a case of nullification. The prosecutor has come in, they've done their job. Hearing the evidence, and despite hearing the arguments, the jury rejects it and the jury acquits the accused. Jury nullification relies on two principles. One, double jeopardy. Once a person is acquitted, that person is acquitted. That's it. And two, jurors' verdicts, particularly acquittals, are not disturbed. No one is going to check you if you harness your power to nullify.
Thanks for that reminder. Do you think this is an example of jury nullification?
I do. We're going to talk about this in a few minutes, but I would be hard pressed to believe that no one knew about this case, right? And so with the knowledge of this case, with the very disturbing video that was presented, one of the many reasons that jurors often nullify is to send a message, right? And this is one way to send a message to law enforcement, right? To people in community. This is one way, right? And it is standby officers, right? Officers can do no harm. I often hear being a police officer is an incredibly hard job. And that's not something that I disagree with. I don't disagree with the fact that being a police officer is a hard job, but you weren't called to be an officer, right? You chose to be. And there are things that come with that. And a huge part of that is respecting, honoring, and caring for individuals that community. Doesn't matter what their race is, doesn't matter what their gender is, doesn't matter what their class is. And I, just like many of you probably on this live, watched that video. And I'm not saying, I want to be clear too, I'm not saying that holding these officers accountable is necessarily putting them in jail. I'm definitely not saying that. But it absolutely sends a message to the Black people in Memphis. That is without question. And it also sends a message to police officers in Memphis and in this country about Black bodies, Black safety, and how we view and care for them.
Thanks for that. And I think about the case involving the two white men who killed Emmett Till. There was no mystery about who killed Emmett Till. There was no really kind of examples of a valid defense, right, in terms of why Emmett Till was killed, besides his beautiful Black skin and the allegation that he said something to a white woman at a store. The all-white, all-male jury found those two men not guilty of killing Emmett Till, and that's an example of jury nullification. We've been hearing jury nullification a lot more in the news today, and you always do a good reminder to say this isn't anything new, right? Nullification has been around since this country was colonized, right? And since this country, and since when people actually, the framers of the Constitution, penned the actual document. I want to shift a little bit from talking about the case involving the officers who killed Tyree Nichols to another case that's been making headlines as it relates to Robert Hinton Jr. Can you tell us a little bit about that case and what's going on with it, to kind of give us a little background?
Yes. So, as many of you probably know, Rodney Hinton lives in Cincinnati, Ohio, and he's been charged with murdering a deputy, a retired deputy, while that deputy was doing traffic duty for during like graduation ceremonies. And so, just taking a step back, I believe it was the day before, Mr. Hinton had gone to view the body worn camera of the fatal shooting of his son, Ryan Hinton. So, police officers claimed and told Rodney Hinton and his family that they were investigating a stolen, I believe it was a stolen vehicle, and that Ryan and a few other friends were in a stolen vehicle, that Ryan and another individual were being chased by police. They saw a gun and they shot Ryan, I believe, 4 times. He was, or I apologize, they fired at least 4 times, but they definitely struck him twice. They struck him once in the chest and once in the arm. That was the story that Mr. Rodney Hinton and his family had when they went in to view the body worn camera. And it's my understanding that when Mr. Hinton, Rodney Hinton, and his family viewed the body worn camera footage, that there were some things that were not consistent with what they were originally told. Now, I don't want to misstate anything, and so I don't know what specifically was inconsistent. But what we do know is after Mr. Hinton watched the body worn camera footage of his son being murdered, he became very upset and very agitated. And so upset and so agitated that there was concern about him driving. And so his family drove him from the police station. The next day, Mr. Hinton was arrested for killing a retired deputy officer. And that's sort of the background of the case where we are right now.
Yeah. And we're not here trying to condone any type of murder. We are here having a conversation about people being at a breaking point, right? The brother of Ryan Hinton, Ryan Hinton is the person who was killed by the police officers, talks about on the body camera, you see his brother running away from the police, and that there's no, at least from the body camera, there's no indication that Ryan turns and points a gun at an officer or anything along those lines.
That is correct.
And I was just talking about, there's a reality in America that Black people have different interactions with law enforcement than white people, right?
That's
and
diplomatic.
I was thinking about, well, I'm the diplomatic one, Porsha.
There you are. Black people be having fucked up interactions with police.
There you go. I was thinking about Dylan Roof, who went into a church and killed members of the congregation. And the way that the officers approached him, very gingerly, very gently, very courteously, taking him to get fast food, right? Somebody who just committed an act of violence. Somebody who the law enforcement knew just killed people. And they didn't shoot him, right? And here we have a teenager who is running away from police officers with a gun in his hand. And we can have different conversations about that. But what was the threat being posed to the officer? And what ends up happening, as you shared, is the father's reaction is essentially, you took mine, I'm going to take one of yours. Are there any parallels that you're seeing between this case and the case involving Luigi Mangione?
Yes, I think these feelings of frustration, these feelings of systems, right? Like, I want to be very clear. Like, we're not just talking about individual frustration, we're talking about collective frustration, right? And we're talking about collective frustrations with systems, whether we're talking about the criminal legal system and its actors, or we're talking about the health system and its actors. There is outrage, there's frustration, there's fatigue, right? With all of these systems. And people are reaching their breaking points. And again, to be very clear, we are not taking a position on individual actions. We're just talking, and we are honoring and noting the different feelings and perspectives that are out there. One thing that I do want to note is that the outrage and the outpouring of the outrage at the care system and people vocalizing different story after story of messed up experiences with healthcare providers, right? People were to talk about those stories, to align themselves with Luigi. Here, it's very interesting because it's the same feeling, right? Both feelings are palpable. And in both cases, someone died, right? In both cases, somebody died. And the person that died in the moment that they were killed, right, were not necessarily doing anything. But this rapid response for Luigi, I'm not seeing that for Mr. Rodney Hinton. I'm not seeing it in the same tone, and I'm seeing it in the same numbers. And for those watching, if I'm wrong, please put in the chat where I can find the same level of support and outpouring for Mr. Hinton as Luigi. I mean, a day did not go by. A day has not gone by without me hearing Mr. Mangione's name, whether we are talking about people identifying with his alleged plight and perspective, or calls to nullify. I'm not hearing that with Mr. Hinton.
One of the things that I like to remind people of with jury nullification is it is sometimes a way in which we as a community can assess whether or not the values of the governed are still consistent with the laws of the government. Let me give you an example. So If you go to trial in a jurisdiction where a person is charged with possessing a nickel bag of weed, and the community really doesn't think that weed is something that should be criminalized anymore, and they continue to vote not guilty for somebody who's factually guilty of possessing a nickel bag of weed, that sends a signal to the prosecutor, to the government, saying, hey, stop wasting your time prosecuting nickel bag of weed cases or simple possession of weed cases, right? Your law that criminalizes simple possession of weed is no longer consistent with our values. And it's interesting to think about in this moment, both in the case as it relates to the healthcare system and the ways in which law enforcement interacts and in instances terrorizes and commits acts of harm against members of the Black community. We are seeing more messages that people are no longer willing to rely on the system that we have inherited to be forms of accountability, because we've tried to utilize the systems that have been in place for too long, and we have not seen a change in results. And so this is unfortunately the latest example we have of a criticism about a system that is not working. And I think we need to be thinking through, how is the system going to adapt and change when its current design is not working for a majority of Americans?
And again, that's actually where jury nullification comes in, right? I will say it until I'm blue in the face, right? Our criminal legal system, as you stated, is a system that we inherited. Black people had no part in the design of the criminal legal system. And I will say it until I'm blue in the face. The criminal legal system, as it stands, wants blood. It is designed to rehabilitate. It is not designed, right, for us to change and be safe. You know, our jails are filled with Black and brown bodies, and people's children are still being slaughtered, right? So, our criminal legal system, as it is right now, is not a safe haven. Whether we are talking about judges or jails, whether we are talking about police or prosecutors, we cannot find safety in the criminal legal system as it stands right now. And I am saying this as an actor in the criminal legal system, right? I am a defense attorney, and I watch every single day how Black people are brutalized, how brown people are brutalized and broken by this system. And so much of what is happening in communities across this country are a reflection of how people are reaching their breaking point, right? People are not finding safety in these systems. They're just not. And that is, as criminal defense lawyers would say, that's a fact change.
Yeah, I think first, let me invite people to start submitting some questions if you haven't already. We'd love to hear your thoughts and questions that you might have. Next, I want to just share, to echo your point about how our criminal legal system is actually not promoting safety. I like to use Louisiana as a case study, right? Louisiana has had the highest incarceration rate in the United States for decades. Yet, if incarceration actually provided public safety, we would be the safest place in the country, but we're not. And that's because incarceration doesn't secure public safety. And we think about this as a system that we inherited, and we can reject this inheritance, right? And I want to make sure people are understanding what I'm saying. We believe in accountability. We do not believe in systems of punishment that aren't holding people accountable and aren't promoting public safety and aren't allowing people to actually thrive in ways that they can when we know that they're properly invested in. Sometimes I'll describe our criminal legal system as the catch basin for the failures of other systems, right? And if we want to improve our criminal legal system, we have to understand that when our education system fails, that directs people to our criminal legal system. When our housing systems fail, that directs people to our criminal legal system. When access to jobs fail, that directs people to the criminal legal system. And we have to we have to stop only focusing on the problems in front of us which are inappropriately labeled as people. And we need to start focusing on the problems that are creating the problems in front of us, which are failed systems. And I think what we're seeing is people are no longer willing to accept these failed systems. And we're reaching a tipping point, we're reaching a breaking point where we need to have more improvement in understanding how these systems are being delivered so that people can actually thrive in our country the way that we all are entitled to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to acknowledge two comments. One, they expect 40 to 60 plus year old laws to work in the present day. You ain't never lie. And these antiquated laws are being visited mostly, right, on Black and brown bodies. And they're laws that we did not have the ability to create. Another comment is mass incarceration of Black people still stands. I could not agree more. It is happening every day in every way. Um, and it's interesting when we talk about, you know, being thrust into a system that wasn't designed for Black safety, and wasn't designed for Black protection. I often think about individuals who are called for jury service, right? And I think about those individuals who go in that deliberation room and they stand on business. They stand on their principles. And that's incredibly hard when you are dealing with the might or the weight of voices telling you to go left, but you know what's right. And I want to shout out each and every person that has willingly shown up when called for jury service and has gone to the back of that deliberation room, and they've stood for Black safety and they've stood for Black justice. I want to encourage each and every one of you not to Google how to get out of jury service. I want to encourage each and every one of you, when you get that battle cry, you get that battle call, to go in and serve if you are concerned about the weight of the criminal legal system. And if you're concerned about Black safety, I want to encourage you to answer that summons.
I love it. Um, Thank you, everybody, for joining us today, this evening, for this conversation. One of the questions that we have, is there any evidence that municipalities are using AI or algorithms to further stack the deck against Black defendants? I'll speak a little bit about algorithms, particularly as it relates to the decision of whether or not a person should be entitled to bail for pretrial release. And there are these things that are utilized that are called risk assessment tools. Depending on the jurisdiction you're in, they call them RATs. And these RATs are designed to take an algorithmic approach to identifying if the person has a previous criminal history, what is the current charge, how long have they been employed, how long have they been unemployed, what's their level of education, how long have they lived at the address that they're currently at, right? What are their community ties? And it takes all these different variables, all these different pieces of data, and then it will then send out a number. And if you're on the lower end of the spectrum, it'll say you can be released safely. If you're in the middle of the spectrum, it says you can be released safely with these conditions. And if you're at the higher end of the spectrum, it says you should not be released and you should be remanded. The big issue with these risk assessment tools is it presumes risk, right? And it does not actually address need. What do these people need in order to thrive and not be involved with the criminal legal system? And so risk assessment tools aren't new. It just is an example of how algorithms have been used to try to generate perspectives of whether or not a person can be safely or unsafe, or can be safely released or not released at all. As it relates to AI, I think one thing we should be paying attention to is the increased amount of surveillance that we have going across all major cities in our country, and the facial recognition technology that is still not working the way they intend it to work, and the harms that come from some of this new technology. I don't have specific examples of how AI has been used, but I know it's being used. I just can't think of some examples in this moment. Porsha-Shaf'on, do you have any examples with AI?
So I don't have any specific examples in the moment, but obviously as a criminal defense attorney, I am deeply concerned about, you know, consistent increased efforts to cage the black body. I am always deeply worried about the lengths that my adversaries will take in order to cage the black body. I am honestly terrified. And I think as a community we should be too, right? For I know that people want to believe in our system, and oftentimes I hear, but that's all we have. And it's not all you have, because you have the power to nullify, right? And, I hope that y'all tune in to lives that we have in the future, where we'll get into the meat and potatoes of your power to nullify. Um, and what nullification can do to change laws. Because if the system, right, is not working for us, then we have to do things that are.
That's right. We have another question about the suspension of habeas corpus, and somebody says they've actually heard somebody from the Trump administration suggest that he's considering the suspension of habeas corpus. Excuse me, the suspension of due process. Let me talk about
Yes.
habeas corpus, and then we can talk about due process. Habeas corpus is a legal principle that says you have to produce the body in front of the court. Essentially, you can't just detain people without having them being brought in front of a judge and indicating like why they're being detained in the first place. So you can file what's called a writ of habeas corpus, which means it's a Latin term to produce the body, essentially authorizing an individual to be brought in court to learn what charges they're being accused of. As it relates to due process, right, there's two different types of due process. There's procedural due process and there's substantive due process. Procedural due process relates to the procedures that are required that the government has to follow before they can take away a person's particular rights. Substantive due process focuses more on the why, like why is the government trying to take away these particular rights. Due process cannot be suspended by the president. Due process, I teach constitutional law. Due process can only be suspended, if I remember correctly, in two instances: in cases of invasion or in cases of rebellion, and when public safety requires it. So from a constitutional perspective, it is not something that the president can just willy-nilly suspend via an executive order. Some of you are saying, well, hell, the Constitution says he can't do a bunch of these other things, and yet he is still doing them. Great question, great point. And I think our systems of checks and balances might be failing us right now, and that's a whole nother conversation.
I want to pause for a second on one of the three instances in which due process can be suspended. I remember, as many of you probably do, I remember what happened, right? I remember the Patriot Act. And I remember communities in droves being like, do whatever you need to do to keep us safe. Have at it. Have your way with us. Suspend whatever you need to suspend. Search whoever you need to search. Do whatever you need to do to keep us safe, right? And our government played on the fear that folks had at the time. And as time went on, we realized, oh shit, this is what suspending, right, due process means. This is what allowing the government to have their way with you, smack you, flip you, rub you down any way they want to, right? This is what it looks like. And inevitably, as in all situations, who bore the brunt of it? Black and brown bodies. So I just want to urge the individuals that are watching this, right? If you're like, look, it's freaking mayhem. It's freaking mayhem right now. So there has to be something going on. There's a lot of violence in our community. So there has to be something going on. I want to remind you of the 1996 crime bill, and every black grandma who wanted Bill Clinton to pass that law. Remember what it did to our communities. Remember what the Patriot Act did to our communities. And remember, even without those, what the criminal legal system what police, prosecutors, and judges are doing to our communities right now. And I want you to think about that deeply. And again, answer that juror summons when you get it. But I want you to think about all of those things and who will inevitably be impacted the most. We had one question about AI for lineups. I definitely heard the argument, the case for AI to be used in lineups as an opportunity to get um, photos or individuals that look as close as possible to the description that law enforcement officers would give. But you can't use AI for lineups because lineups are human beings. And so you can't use intelligence for the actual lineups, but you can, or there is a case that is being made for using AI for photo arrays, and based on descriptions that law enforcement is given, them utilizing AI generated photos to get the most accurate reflection of the descriptions that they're given. But again, whenever we give law enforcement an inch, they take a whole country mile of rights of ours. So I'm always deeply concerned about any arguments to kick up their authority a notch.
I hear that. Thank you all for these questions. They have certainly helped us conclude our conversation for this evening. This is a series that we are doing called Jury Duty Unmasked. Not only do we talk about things related to jury service and the importance of showing up for jury service and the power that exists in that jury deliberation room and in that jury box, we're also here to answer questions that you might have about the criminal legal system at large. And if it's something that we can answer, we'll answer. And if it's not, then we'll do some research and try to get you the answer a little later. We do strongly believe that an informed citizen is an informed juror. And that's what this series is about, to make sure we are informing you about all the things we think you should know as a potential future juror and as a person who's living in America with all of us. Thank you for joining us this evening. Tune in again next month, where we'll be having another Jury Duty Unmasked conversation, and have a good night.
Good night.
Bye.